Hi, everyone. Welcome to Explorations in the Medical Humanities, an event series hosted by the Society of Fellows and Heyman Center for the Humanities here at Columbia University. Explorations in the Medical Humanities explores how texts, global developments, and our changing environment relate back to the experience of bodies in different stages of health and disease. Today, we're gathered virtually to celebrate a new book, Generation Dread, Finding Purpose in an Age of Climate Change, authored by Dr. Britt Ray. I'm Helen Zhao, a Public Humanities Fellow at the Society of Fellows and Heyman Center for the Humanities, and I'm one of the coordinators of the Explorations in the Medical Humanities series. I'm absolutely thrilled to host this event featuring incredible speakers on a timely topic, and I look forward to a rich conversation. So before I introduce our moderator for tonight, Dr. Kate Marvel, who will introduce our speakers, I just want to say a quick word about the event format. So following presentations by each of our speakers, Dr. Marvel will open the floor to questions from the audience. And at this point, we highly encourage you to actively participate. So please direct any questions or comments to Dr. Marvel in the chat box, and she'll be sure to bring them up during the discussion. So with that, it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Kate Marvel, whom we are very fortunate to have with us tonight. Dr. Marvel teaches in Columbia's MA in Climate and Society program and writes the Hot Planet column for Scientific American. She uses climate models, observations, paleoclimate reconstructions, and basic theory to study climate change. Her work has identified human influences on present-day cloud cover, rainfall patterns, and drought risk. She is also interested in future climate changes, particularly climate feedback processes and the planet's sensitivity to increased carbon dioxide. Named one of 15 women who will save the world by Time magazine, she has been profiled by the New York Times and Rolling Stone, and her 2017 TED Talk has been viewed over 1 million times. Before becoming a climate scientist, she received a PhD in theoretical particle physics from Cambridge University, where she was a Gates Scholar. Welcome, Dr. Marvel.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I am really excited to be able to introduce our panelists. So first, Dr. Britt Ray is a Human and Planetary Health Fellow at the Stanford Center for Innovation and Global Health, the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment, and the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine Center on Climate Change and Planetary Health. Britt's research focuses on the mental health impacts of the ecological crisis. She's the creator of the newsletter about staying sane in the climate crisis, Gen Dread, which you can find at gendread.substack.com. And she's the author of the book that she'll be talking about tonight, Generation Dread, Finding Purpose in an Age of Climate Crisis, which was just shortlisted for the Governor General's Award, which is Canada's highest literary award. Britt has a PhD in science communication from the University of Copenhagen, and her first book is Rise of the Necrofauna, The Science, Ethics, and Risks of De-Extinction. She's hosted several podcasts, radio, and TV programs with the BBC, CBC, and NPR. And our respondent tonight is Dr. Catherine Shear. Dr. Shear is the Marion E. Kenworthy Professor of Psychiatry at Columbia University and the founding director of the Center for Complicated Grief at Columbia School of Social Work. Dr. Shear is a clinical researcher who first worked in anxiety and depression and held several academic appointments in these areas. For the last 2 decades, she's focused on understanding and treating people who experience persistent, intense grief. She developed and tested prolonged grief disorder therapy, a short-term targeted intervention, and confirmed its efficacy in 3 large studies. It's strength-based and focused on fostering adaptation to loss. Dr. Shear is widely recognized for her work in bereavement, including both research and clinical awards from the Association for Death Education and Counseling, and invited authorship of articles for Up to Date and the New England Journal of Medicine. Dr. Shear is also engaged in teaching and training students and professionals of several mental health disciplines in the identification and treatment of prolonged grief disorder. She's a graduate of the University of Chicago and Tufts University School of Medicine, and she completed residencies in internal medicine and psychiatry at New York City medical centers. So with that, I would like to invite Britt to share her screen. I'm really excited to hear what she has to say.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Marvel, for that incredibly kind introduction. And thank you also, Helen, for organizing. And I look forward to chatting with you, Dr. Shear. Let me just get this going. Okay, hopefully we're in drive. Looking good? Perfect. Well, thank you for coming, everyone, tonight. I just want to let you know that we're going to get into some material that is emotionally distressing. It's just a forewarning, and I go there in order to hopefully help us explore more constructive responses to the emotional distress that some of us might be feeling around the climate crisis. And I share some personal backstory as a part of this, not because I think my story is particularly important, it really is not, but just because I believe it's becoming increasingly vital to model vulnerability in the climate crisis in terms of how it's showing up in our hearts and in our guts and in our nightmares. So, Generation Dread, Finding Purpose in an Age of Climate Crisis came out in May, and I've been writing this book since 2017. Why did I write it? Well, I have a background in conservation biology. I was studying the sixth mass extinction day in, day out for years, and of course I had felt sad. I'd felt elements of grief about what our human race is doing to the natural world and non-human, the more than human world. I worked for many years as a science journalist, and of course then had to confront a lot of scientific articles about the climate crisis, every single IPCC report, and so on. But in 2017, a new cadre of writing came out about the climate crisis. It was increasingly existential. It was very terrifying. It was really spelling out the worst possible outcomes as being our likely fate. And I couldn't help but get glued to it. It started to show up in my life as a more profound form of distress than what I'd already experienced for years around the climate and wider ecological crisis. And at that time, my partner and I were starting to talk very seriously about wanting to try and get pregnant. And being at my day job, dealing with the scientists and dealing with the reports that were coming across my desk, and then going home and talking to my partner about trying to get pregnant just started to feel all the more tenuous rather quickly. It became this huge dilemma in my life where I no longer felt that that was really a wise thing to do, to commit another person who didn't need to be here to our warming world. But I felt pretty isolated in these concerns. I didn't see them reflected in the wider society around me. And I could tell that when I brought them up with people in my circles, I was making them uncomfortable. I became that really annoying person who started talking about climate trauma at dinner parties and barbecues, and it was alienating people from me, and certainly was one of the unhappier chapters in my life. In the years since, what was at that time an underground conversation of climate concerned millennials and Gen Zers has really come to be an overground conversation whereby it's no longer surprising to hear that people are connecting the climate crisis to family planning. Everybody and their grandma has kind of heard of this. We have statistics and op-eds, academic studies to prove it. We've seen the launch of political movements such as Birth Strike or the No Future, No Children pledge launched by climate activists who the undersigned say are refusing to reproduce until governments make it safe for them to do so by taking adequate climate action. And one shocking statistic from a poll in the US done in 2020 found that 78% of Gen Zers aren't planning to have kids because of their climate awareness. So things really changed in a head spinningly fast way around this topic. And while the reproductive anxiety piece was my own personal dilemma and way into investigating the psychological impacts of the climate crisis, when I scratched the surface, I saw, oh, geez, that's just the tip of the iceberg. And there are much wider, more encapsulating and profound harms to mental health and well-being and the incurrence of psychological distress that are showing up in diverse people's lives. So I set out to then turn my science communicator brain in on myself and see what was going on, why was I so rattled, what can I do about it? And I set out to write a book that I needed at that time. My aims were really to normalize and validate the existence of climate anxiety, ecological grief, climate distress, to bring it out into the open and explore what we know from a research perspective, as well as qualitative experience from people who could talk about their struggles. I also wanted to highlight the unbearable burden that the climate crisis is putting on today's young people around the world writ large in terms of threats to their mental health. And I wanted to help advance a global conversation about the mental health impacts of the climate crisis and the need for mental health protection and promotion policies at this time. Amazingly, it's only the last IPCC report that came out that has any mention of mental health within its pages. So we're starting to get there at the top levels of knowledge gathering and what is then put into the hands of policymakers, but it's quite behind where the research is at in terms of the academic field, and we need to help close that gap. Oh, and here we are. So you might already know what I'm talking about. Perhaps you've felt some perturbance on an emotional heart level because of the climate crisis. And perhaps you have the terminology, but for many, many we don't. And it's the question of, what do I even call this unsettling feeling? And there is an emerging vocabulary to help better describe the way that people are relating to a changing earth. So I mentioned eco-anxiety, which the American Psychological Association has defined as the chronic fear of environmental doom. Climate anxiety is just a climate specific form of that. There's ecological grief, which refers to real feelings of loss about changing landscapes and cultural identities that are tied up with the landscape, for instance, or livelihoods, and also an anticipatory grief, grieving for a future that you believe is to come, which has a bunch of losses baked into it. It isn't just anxiety and grief, though. We see that there's actually an umbrella of challenging emotions a person can cycle through when confronting the climate crisis, including guilt, despair, hopelessness, helplessness, anger, outrage, and so on. And increasingly, the field is referring to eco-distress as a more accurate catch-all term, which also doesn't pathologize these emotions. Interestingly, solistalgia is this term that has really taken people's imaginations by storm. It comes to us by Glenn Albrecht, an Australian philosopher, who describes it as the homesickness you feel when you're still at home, but the environment has changed so much there that you no longer recognize it for what it once was and can't access the solace that you used to. And this set of difficult emotions, and particularly the grief, belongs to what psychologists call disenfranchised grief. So the grief that is not recognized, the grief for which we lack social norms to be able to come together and move through it with support. It's similar to what we often see around suicide and fertility issues, miscarriage, abortion, where it's awkward, it's difficult for people to really bring it up and reckon with it together. We're experiencing that with the planetary grievances underway. And I mentioned that this is not a disorder. A general consensus has emerged in the climate mental health research field to say that. And it's like, you know, here, it's explained in this comic. It would be as though telling this koala that it has a mental health problem when we've cut down all of its eucalyptus trees. So if we can reframe this to understand eco-anxiety is not something you can get a diagnosis for, it's not a mental disorder, it's actually a very rational and normal response to be distressed by what's going on, and we can flip it and understand it to be a form of eco-compassion instead, a badge of honor of caring for what is in harm's way, as well as an attachment to reality. Then we start to see ways in which we can tap into the empowerment of these emotions, which is where we will get into. However, it's not all just a rosy story of realizing that you're compassionate in your care and therefore you can tap into this as strength. Eco-anxiety really occurs along a spectrum, and the leading climate aware therapist, Caroline Hickman, has done clinical research with children, youth, adults, and stressed out parents all over the world. And from her clinical observations has put the way that eco-anxiety manifests into 4 buckets, from mild, medium, significant to severe. And we know potential for eco-anxiety to be constructive, a kind of practical type of anxiety that gets you to really sit up straight, take notice of what's going on, and plan constructive responses that are attached to climate action and fostering resilience within one's community. However, we also know that this type of distress can become so debilitating that it traps a person in a state of fatalism or hopelessness or despair, and can even lead to total disrupted daily functioning and suicidality. And indeed, we do have cases of suicidal completion within our young people who have attributed that to climate anxiety. So it does demand serious attention and support. How then can we help people harness the constructive and practical elements of this anxiety while steering clear of the threats to mental health and well-being? Well, In my own plight around climate anxiety as it related to this baby dilemma that I was wrestling with, I discovered pretty quickly how my own privileges as a white middle-class Canadian were fueling my climate anxiety. My lack of experience with existential threat meant that I had a lower reserve of existential resilience to rely on, and that I really had to learn to cultivate it through a process of emotional internal activism, which I'll get to. But this has been called out. Sarah Jaquette Ray writes in Scientific American that climate anxiety is an overwhelmingly and even unbearably white phenomenon, whereby the privileged and protected among us turn inwards to only notice how they're distressed within this crisis instead of looking outwards to understand the position in which they are upholding systems that create deepening climate injustices in a warming world for the most marginalized. And so this is very appropriate to be able to look at, hey, what does it mean to live well with climate anxiety? That's a justice issue in itself. But when we tap into the data, it actually shows us something different. This is not just a form of distress for the worried well, so to speak. And that opens up powerful pathways for potential new bridges of solidarity, whereby those who have been up to perhaps say recently privileged and protected can now sense that chronic threat to their ontological security, which marginalized communities know is a tale as old as the hills of has been to survive within systems that don't care about them. And so why do I say the data shows this? Well, firstly, Kyle White, who is an Indigenous philosopher, environmental justice researcher, and member of the Potawatomi Nation, writes that as the fear of climate chaos escalates amidst the public at large, for Indigenous peoples, this all feels like deja vu. Uh, those who survived the genocide of settler colonialism had to learn how to cope and subsist and survive and even flourish in the midst of new environmental pressures, which is what humanity writ large is now on the quest of doing as we simultaneously mitigate more harm while adapting to a warming planet at the same time. And the Yale program on climate communication shows us that it's actually the Black community, Latino community who feel more alarmed or concerned about climate change in America than whites, which interestingly also translates into greater agency and action taking. And my colleagues and I last year surveyed 10,000 16 to 25-year-olds in 10 countries around the world across low, medium, and high income settings. We were looking in Australia, Brazil, Finland, France, India, Nigeria, Philippines, Portugal, UK, and US, trying to understand young people's psychological responses to the crisis. Now, we found that 45% of the global respondents reported that their daily functioning is being impaired by their climate thoughts and feelings. So that's basic things like being able to eat, play, go to school, have fun, be in relationship. This is a huge number. This statistic jumped to 67% in Nigeria and 74% in India and the Philippines, whereby young people reported in that grand total of daily impairment from climate thoughts and feelings. So this really is not just an issue for the worried well. However, it's one more layer of distress on top of other competing issues in the lives of many who are dealing with, whether it be poverty, authoritarian repression from government regimes, systemic racism, and so on. We also found that 59% said that they're very or extremely worried about the climate crisis. 75% say the future is frightening to them. 56% declared that humanity is doomed in their mind, and 39% expressed hesitancy to have their own children as a result of the climate crisis. More than 50% of those 10,000 around the world told us that they feel sad, afraid, anxious, angry, powerless, helpless, and guilty. And interestingly, the least reported emotions were being optimistic or indifferent to the crisis. Now, these thoughts and feelings were also significantly associated with a sense of being failed by governments and betrayed by leaders, which introduces us to this important concept of institutional betrayal that comes out of the betrayal trauma work, which refers to wrongdoings perpetrated by an institution upon individuals dependent on that institution. And when we think about young people around the world dependent on their governments to come together and coalesce globally to take the correct action to meet our Paris Agreement goals, witnessing that that is not happening while being relatively powerless in terms of many being too young to even vote, let alone take up important decision-making offices in society. We see that institutional betrayal is being recognized by young people, which can be psychologically injurious in both pragmatic and general ways of rising distress. This relates to the concept of moral injury, and a moral injury can occur in response to acting or witnessing behaviors that go against an individual's values and moral beliefs. So having one's conscience be activated because the sense of what's right and wrong is being violated again and again is an aspect of the political nature of these emotions. It's not just that young people are sad, let's say, because the environment isn't doing well. It's because they feel like many power holders in society and adults writ large have left the building. Although that's not true, and many are working very hard in order to protect them, it isn't yet what the dominant system is doing. So this is part of the psychological harm we see. Now, I'm sure you have all seen this by now, and if you haven't, I'll just play a few moments of this, but this is Just Stop Oil activists in the National Portrait Gallery in London taking a very shocking action. Van Gogh's sunflowers being splattered with a can of soup in order to ask the question of what matters more, art or life. And rather than debate or talk to each other right now about whether one agrees with these tactics, which is the hottest debate on Twitter at the moment around what these two brave young activists have done, this is really a response, in my opinion, to the institutional betrayal that many young people feeling by going into institutions and declaring that investment in fossil fuels needs to stop immediately, and action in terms of overhauling our society towards a green economy and regenerative energy system is most direly needed. So although many people are very upset about the decision that these young people took, I think that this tweet encapsulates the rationale quite clearly, but which aligns with what we're noticing in the research. So if more people understood the depth of despair and grief so many young people are carrying right now, their more radical tactics would be put into perspective as an act of life-affirming agency in a society that has utterly failed them. This is the crying voice of despair in which we hear many young activists speaking to us on the climate crisis in our research. So let's just back up a second and look at climate change and mental health and how they interact. It isn't just this unidirectional relationship whereby the climate crisis has these acute and subacute and chronic stressors that then directly and indirectly affect our mental health. Also, when our mental health is threatened, when we are depleted as communities, when we are burnt out, and when we are increasingly traumatized, that affects the climate action that we can take. Because when people are so depleted that they must then focus only on number one, which is survival, there's not much capacity left to be able to take on the life-saving actions now required in many aspects of reforming our society. So this is really important to understand the bidirectional nature of these two constructs, but also then that we can tap into solutions that have co-benefits both for planetary health as it addresses the climate crisis and our mental health as it addresses our well-being as people. So just briefly, I mentioned acute climate stressors. So I'm talking about extreme weather events, wildfires, superstorms, that sort of thing, and heat waves. We know that the psychological impact from disasters can exceed physical injury about 40 to 1. And that after hurricanes and wildfires, droughts, floods, floods, new diagnosable mental illnesses such as PTSD, depression, and anxiety often spike, and suicidal thoughts and death by suicide as well, particularly on extremely hot days, are found in the data around the world across many timeframes. There's also chronic climate stressors such as forced migration, insecure livelihoods and cultural practices, food and water insecurity, which affects mental and emotional distress. It can really cause a gain of that, and overall threatens the social determinants of what underpin our mental health and well-being. And we also know that some groups are more vulnerable than others, namely children and young people, women, indigenous communities, people with pre-existing mental illnesses who have 2 to 3 times more likelihood to die in a heat wave, people with livelihoods and cultures strongly connected to the land, such as farmers, and people experiencing direct climate impacts, and those with limited capacity to adapt because they're in a disaster zone. Another group that often gets overlooked, though, are frontline climate and environmental professionals. So climate scientists, environmental activists, journalists, people who have the commitment of studiously bearing witness to the ecological and climate crisis day in, day out. That can carry a psychological toll for some. As the climate researcher Kim Nicholas writes about her experience in science, that she has to sink into her grief, and she really had to learn how to process it to be able to continue doing her work and not quit out of mental exhaustion. So I'm just going to read a testimony from a very accomplished climate journalist who reached out to me to explain the experience that she was having. I'm a science writer and author, and I've been plugging away at the coal face of climate issues for 20 years. I should be at the top of my game, more than 10 books and countless pieces of journalism behind me. Yet in March this year, I ended up in hospital with a fever of life-threatening depression. After years of wrestling with the overwhelm of seeing the climate unraveling at breakneck speed, I just didn't think I could do this anymore. You know that scene at the end of the movie, Don't Look Up, where the scientists are sitting at the table, having their last dinner, making distracting small talk as they wait for the asteroid to hit? I feel as though I'm at that table, but all alone. I know I'm part of a community of activists, but this is nevertheless an existentially lonely place to be, and it's agony at times. And I just wonder, you don't have to say anything or raise your hand, but have you ever felt this way, even just a smidgen of it? Many people sit alone with their heavy existential feelings around the climate crisis, as though the weight of the world is on their shoulders only. But if we can step out of that isolation and start to pierce the bubble of silence around this experience, much relief can quickly be found. I was confronted, I was approached rather by a climate science postdoc last year who said, you know what, my colleagues and I are despairing. We are biking to the lab to study how the climate crisis impacts wildfires while wearing masks to protect us from wildfire smoke. It's getting uncanny. It's weird. It's heavy. We don't know what to do. We haven't been trained to acknowledge emotions in our kind of hyper rationalist approach to dealing with the climate crisis and gathering knowledge. Is there something that you can help us with? Is there a way that we can process this and create permissions around it in our field that otherwise ignores that there's any emotional impact at all to doing this work? And so we got together and we started brainstorming, and now we're going to be teaching a new course in Stanford's new Doerr School of Sustainability, which you might have heard is very controversial because the dean has said that he's willing to take fossil fuel money, and that's still a wrestle that's being had right now. But so we're going to soon offer this graduate course for climate economics, climate litigation, and climate science students, whereby they go through lots of modalities and contemplative practices and learning from the wisdom of activists, Buddhist scholars, indigenous thinkers, psychologists, psychiatrists, and many other people in between. And after they experience a variety of activities to help them process what they're experiencing, they then are tasked with coming up with official recommendations for curriculum redesign that could be put into the school to better support the next generation of climate science students coming up who might be experiencing the psychological toll of this work as well. And Susie Moser, who writes in the fantastic climate anthology, All We Can Save, burnt out people are not equipped to serve a burning planet. So we really do need to tend to the needs of our frontline climate workers in an escalating climate crisis where we need all that talent for the long haul. Just very briefly, this was also increasingly coming up in high schools and in undergraduate programs by environmental science instructors who were saying, I'm just doing my job. I'm just giving them the lectures that I'm meant to. And yet I can see that I'm just fomenting my students' despair and depression. And they tell me they want to quit and that it's too much learning all about this. Maybe the way I'm teaching is making it worse. And yes, as we continuously over describe the problem again and again without focusing on acknowledging the emotional burden and psychological intensity of this, or C, really diving deep into solutions. Cognitive psychology shows us why this is so damaging, and many young people are suffering with a sense of futurelessness and hopelessness because of the ways in which we are grappling with the climate crisis, often also in the classroom. So a bunch of these professors and teachers came together and they said, you know what, we got to change this. Here's all the things I'm trying, here's what's worked. And they put it onto this fantastic resource, the Existential Toolkit for Climate Justice Educators, which is available at existentialtoolkit.com. I'm not part of it. I just think it's important for people to know about this, because you can deploy a variety of different activities and workshop things in your classroom if you are also experiencing this with the people who you're learning about climate amongst. Okay. So before we get to the state of distress, often we are in some form of psychological defense around the climate crisis. And we have a bunch of psychological defenses, which we've rightfully evolved to protect us from pain, because we are pretty hardwired to avoid or at least distance ourselves from things that overwhelm us and that are chronically stressful. But in this long-term threat scenario of the climate crisis, which requires all hands on deck all the time, these psychological defenses are really screwing our progress up. And we need to get clear about what might be going on, often unconsciously, so that we aren't thwarted in our best ambitions towards action by them. We talk about denial typically as this kind of ideological, corporate malfeasance, whereby the truth of the greenhouse effect is just all out negated for corporate gain. But denial is a much softer process, and psychoanalysts really spell this out beautifully for us, how the unconscious holds a variety of tactics that will allow us to pretend ourselves away from reality, even perversely, even when the costs of that pretend are so detrimental to our well-being. In these forms of unconscious automatic process, which can really trip us up. Disavowal is one big one when it comes to how we might relate to the climate crisis. I know that I was living in disavowal for many years. It's like having one eye open to the truth, where we read all the science, we believe this is urgent and important, no one's denying that. We absorb information about soon surpassing deadly climate tipping points that will unleash all kinds of cascading change that's irreversible, and then simultaneously we close the other eye to the truth. We never really let it land in our heart or guts that something that terrible could ever come to pass, and we continue living our lives according to our desires, hop on the next plane, what have you. And so it's a way of knowing without feeling, but when we are knowing without feeling, we are blocked essentially from some of our deepest motivators and ways of cultivating courage and going forth. So another kind of defense, which is kind of a weird one, is doomism and fatalism. The idea that, you know, the die is cast, there's nothing that can be done, it's too late now, and so just reach out and tell someone you love them before the ship that we're all on sinks. We're seeing this approach, which says action is futile, rising in society, and it's a very dangerous approach to defend one's psychology. The way in which it's a defense is that we are confronted with an immense amount of uncertainty about how bad this is going to get in our lifetimes, how it's going to impact communities and people and landscapes that we love, and so on and so forth. But this narrative allows us to land on something that sounds certain, which brings relief, because the human mind is terrible at confronting uncertainty. We really detest it for all kinds of good evolutionary reasons again, but this can really produce a false narrative. Even though it lets us finally rest our feet in a place that sounds certain, we'd rather be there, some of us, even though it spells out the apocalypse, than actually do the hard work of coming back into accuracy, which is holding the uncertainty and acting anyway, taking action for the present moment rightness of it, rather than prescribing this kind of all out unjust narrative that gives up on all of our commitments and future generations. So we have psychological responses that can lead to climate action. We know that when we get pushed outside of our window of tolerance for stress, we become hyper vigilant with anxiety, we can feel fear and terror and panic. We can just essentially go into a dissociative space, or freeze, or resign into fatalism even, and that produces inaction. Similarly, though, if we're so underwhelmed and kind of lethargic in terms of our emotional attachment to the crisis, where we can just subsist in denial or disavowal, that also leads to inaction. So we need to be wise about what's going on in terms of ways that we're really trying to just protect our comfort in the present, but at the cost of the future becoming terrifying. So we'd better understand if these are alive within ourselves, because it is not too late. Uh, Climate scientists tell us over and over again that there's still a lot that we can do to protect our societies and foster a better future than will otherwise come if we have all of the courageous commitment, action, and devotion now. So we need to use this precious time that we have. It's an incredibly auspicious time to be alive. And we can harness eco distress for a deeper sense of purpose and courageous commitment to this climate action. So this is our big opportunity, which I certainly felt my own transformation around by going into the U-shaped curve of grief and despair around the climate crisis and finding different ways to crawl out of it using other people's insights, which I'll share. So this is really an invitation to engage in internal activism. We always hear about action being so urgent in the climate crisis, and yes, technology and policy and informed by science and so on. And yeah, we need all that, and that's super crucial. But this idea that action is the antidote to despair, when action is only prescribed as that kind of external action, can, although it is helpful, of course, to take action, can also reflect a culture of belittlement around emotions and their importance to our lives, and where we often get our deep well of energy and clarity to act. We do things because of our emotions, and so while many of us are still cultured by a time in late capitalism whereby we've been told that we need to put our best face forward, and it's also tipped over into toxic positivity whereby people kind of suppress and deny challenging emotions that can come up within them. That's not appropriate for a climate crisis. It's totally rational and okay, and in some cases unavoidable to feel distress around what's going on with the climate and ecological crisis. Therefore, being able to cultivate the openness to allow those emotions to be there, to get curious about them, to provide some space to learn how to integrate them into our lives, so that action is the antidote to despair when that involves this kind of internal action of exploring what's within us. Well, then that becomes a much more powerful way of driving us towards collective action for a long haul. Contemplative practices are huge here. That would require a totally different lecture to go into about what mindfulness and meditation and thousands of years of human wisdom can teach us about emotional integration in the face of despair, feelings like hopelessness, and so on. And I write about them a lot in the book. But one easy piece that I can have time to talk about is that we need to come together. We need to step out of isolation and create permission-giving places to reckon with and validate this collective grief that we are experiencing, to make it okay to hold up a mirror so that when people come to share, they know that they're not going to be met with a response like, don't be so dire, you're fine, or you're just being overly dramatic, which often does happen. And I've interviewed many people who say that when going to a well-meaning friend or family member or a therapist who isn't climate aware and getting that kind of response, just writing it off as catastrophic thinking, will leave them, of course, feeling many times worse after all and further isolated, and then less likely to share what's on their minds and hearts next time, which is damaging. So this containment of climate emotions is supported by an evolving cottage industry that's popped up in the last few years, really to meet the moment whereby climate and eco anxiety are becoming these household terms, and people are hungry for coping mechanisms. Well, it's not rocket science. A lot of it comes down to really simple stuff of working in community. So one-off drop-in sessions offered by a place like Climate Awakening, which the psychologist and climate activist Margaret Clyde Solomon runs, or climate cafes, which are decentralized meetings to have heart-forward conversations about climate feelings popping up all over the world. You can just search them in your city and see if there's any or virtual offerings that you could tap into. Then there's also the more process-based or programmatic approaches of really moving in community through eco-anxiety and grief towards being able to reinvest the energy that you've lost from being so stressed out into actions that matter and that are authentic and purposeful to you by the end of the program. A big one in this space is the Good Grief Network. They offer a 10-step program that's actually modeled off of Alcoholics Anonymous for moving people through this work. The Work That Reconnects by Joanna Macy is another powerful one, as well as the All We Can Say Project circles, which are attached to the Feminist Climate Anthology book. And then you might not have heard of this yet, but there are a burgeoning field of climate aware therapists out there who are professionally allied in places like the Climate Psychology Alliance of North America, of the UK, and the Climate Psychiatry Alliance. And there's many others in Russia and parts of Asia and Australia popping up. And here, the badge of the climate aware therapist is to start from a place of understanding and knowing that the task is not to try and cure you of your climate anxiety, so to speak, because it's not a disorder and not something to dismiss with a pill, but to really help you explore it, understand it, live more comfortably with it. And then while it's inadequate to just, so to speak, self-soothe as the planet burns, find ways of harnessing that energy for the actions that help you be part of exercising your agency and making a difference with others. So the ability to hold seemingly conflicting emotions at the same time is really key as well. Hope and hopelessness, or optimism and despair, are not things that actually can't come together. They can very much meld in the hearts of people who are doing this work, and very familiar, toggling between a variety of complicated emotions. We need to find our balance within this matrix of feelings and allow them all to be there, and get beyond this kind of really old debate of hope versus fear and which tactics we have to use to motivate people to action. There's value in every emotion. They carry important information, often life-saving information, and it is our job to listen and allow our multiplicity to exist as part of our clarity on the crisis. And I love this quotation by Adrienne Maree Brown, the author and activist, and she says, "What we pay attention to grows." And it's just so incredibly true in this era of doom scrolling. It is just so easy to only take in the negative news stories about what is falling apart, sometimes even faster than scientists predicted. It can be really overwhelming for a person's nervous system and lead to a foreshortened sense of what's possible in the future, which is a huge tragedy and unjust, because solutions are simultaneously being worked on and available, and many emergent futures await that we can become a part of. So being able to really do simple things like monitor your digital diet can help a lot of people. Removing certain apps or knowing which ones you're on for which amounts of time can really lower people's distress level. And tapping into things like the solutions journalism movement, whereby it's not just all about heightening engagement and awareness through what is negative, which we know obviously propels mainstream news. Now, one thing that really helped me in my own exploration was tapping into the work of Robert J. Lipton, a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst who really bore witness to how humans can create and give permission to evil throughout the 20th century, studying, Nazis who perpetrated crimes in concentration camps, and communist thought reform, and he was on the ground after Hiroshima and many other kinds of atrocities. And he says that when it comes to the climate crisis, the prospective survivor is what we really need to hold on to now. And so while a real survivor is someone who has touched death but made it out alive, the prospective survivor is someone who has vividly imagined how they might perish and uses the energy of that mortality awareness to move them into their boldest, grandest solidarity with our species to act on this crisis and really show up at this existential time to be a different form of yourself, a bolder, more convicted, more courageous form of yourself, so that when we all really lean into that kind of existential resilience, we can harness the only form of energy that can really prevent the worst outcomes from happening, and that this is what we need, and that it's a time to be really awake and really feel the revitalizing force of this. And I thought that this was absolutely touching the nerve in the way that I needed it to shake me out of my forms of distress and understand what we're really talking about and outline the spaces through which I can move and make a meaningful contribution. And as has been shown time and again through so many social justice struggles, hope is a verb. It's something you do, it's something you create with others. And this is the kind of energy that can get us there in a worsening climate crisis. And also, in the book, I interview people who have chronic illnesses, diagnoses whereby they're told that they're going to die a young death, and sitting with that uncertainty every day about, is today the last day? Will it be next week? Will it be next year? We don't know. And what that meant for really grieving and accepting their condition unleashed this incredible power of imagination for how to use all the time that they're given, where every day is a blessing and thereby something to really extract meaning and purpose from, where everything is intentional and everything is joyful and everything is helpful. So in these ways, looking at the climate crisis as an opportunity for us to do that kind of rearranging on the inside with our emotions becomes a huge boon to the climate movement writ large when we understand the energy and conviction we can get from that kind of perspective. So I'm coming to the end now. Please let me know if I'm going too long. But another thing that has really popped up again and again throughout the research is that it's important to recognize that while this might feel like an end of worlds to some because the climate we grew up with is slipping away and we have to get to know a new world, which scientists have predicted in grim detail, but there's still so much room to shape it. The world has ended many times before for many types of people, whether it's the Nigerian American philosopher Olufemi Taiwo telling me that, for him, coming from the anti-colonial political perspective, his people for the last 500 years, they had the transatlantic slave trade and they had Jim Crow and they had colonial apartheid. And while what is happening now is neo-colonial with the climate crisis and not in any way just, it's in fact better for his people now than it has been for the last 500 years. And so there's a kind of sky is falling mentality that is prevented from that political position. Or similarly, speaking with indigenous leaders or someone like Wabkashig Rice, who's an Anishinaabe writer from Wisapsing Nation in Canada, saying, the climate crisis is hardly an apocalypse. Like, the apocalypse already happened. The apocalypse is the history of my people. First, when the white man came, then when they wouldn't let us speak our languages, took all of our land, took our children, put them in residential school. And we're actually in the best position now to raise proud and aware Indigenous children. So I haven't met any Indigenous folks saying that they don't want to have kids because of the climate crisis. These kinds of different cultural lenses through which to understand what we're dealing with help to really just give the space that if for example, for those two lineages, people had given up because it felt hopeless, which it would have of course been very understandable to feel hopeless in those situations, think of all the better futures that would have been missed, right? And so right now it's similar, but for more people included than ever before, that we have a duty to come together and work in community so that we don't miss those better futures that are waiting for us to bring into our own lived moment. And lastly, what really excited me is that although we have to deal with more disasters, and of course this creates trauma and mental disorders will spread, the research outlines that more than aid from governments, for instance, what we can do to help each other get through these rocky times is increase our social capital in the places where we live, increase our social trust and our connectedness. We can rebuild much faster after adversity when we are living in places where we really truly know our neighbors. We can also spread mental health care beyond the biomedical model, which is narrow, it's one-on-one. We don't have enough therapists and specialists to help deal with the scope of psychic damage that the climate crisis is causing. And it's at high cost. People who are in need can't afford it. Instead, we can look to what people in global mental health have done to get care into low resource settings. You can strip away the jargon from interventions and you can train lay people, people in your community on how to help community members, people who are in the barbershops, at their kids' schools, in the grocery store, with anxiety and depression. And many clinical trials, for instance, have shown that these can often lead to better recovery rates than primary care. And so this kind of task shifting model, investing in our communities, along with the fact that if you just listen to young climate activists today, the thing that gets them out of bed in the morning, the thing that makes this possible to take it all on, is doing it with others and working in community, is truly a salve and a healing that we can depend on, and that we must, in order to access flourishing moving forward. So we're being asked to stay with the trouble. How can we not turn away out of self-protection when reality is increasingly tough to bear, and lean into the auspicious time that it is to be alive? I have found that some really helpful questions for guiding one's own navigation is, what do you love most about being alive? And what breaks your heart about the world? And what's the most meaningful climate work that you can do in this huge opportunity of being here that we each have, as we are lucky to get to wake up and be alive in such an interesting and formative time for the human species. We need 1 billion climate activists, loosely defined, making their way, authoring their own stories, because we are fickle creatures. We don't like to have actions prescribed to us. We don't like to be told what to do, but instead, if we can start imploring what brings us joy and satisfaction and what we're good at, there's actually a great Venn diagram that comes from Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson, which guides people towards their heart-centered, courageous climate work. Then we can start being the authors of our own story in order to find the ways that will more likely stick. There's a lot more to share that I couldn't touch on, but essentially different coping skills, from internal activism and ways of working in community and identifying meaningful action, allowed me to leave my old field of synthetic biology, make a career change by banging my head against my kitchen table for a couple of years, learning the basics of mental health, even though I didn't have a background in it, in order to then switch my academic career to climate and mental health, which I'm now doing, develop that flexible thinking around and away from the kind of hopelessness and despair that I was living in. And Dr. Marvel has written most beautifully of all about the need for courage and getting beyond this obsession with what gives you hope. What we need is courage. A similar kind of process came through from writing this book. And while I completely understand why many people are deciding not to have kids in the climate crisis, all of this allowed me to eventually see the act of not having a child, not the same for others, but for me would be a commitment to my fear, while having the child that I wanted was a commitment to joy, which I think is a really key ingredient for all of us moving forward. Because as I see it, hope, best said by Václav Havel, is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense regardless of how it turns out. So I thank you so much for being here and letting me share this series of thoughts with you. I'll close with this summation, which comes from researchers who wrote in the Lancet Planetary Health in an article called Ecological Grief and Anxiety, the Start of a Healthy Response to Climate Change. I think the best way of explaining the opportunity of the rise of eco-distress in our society right now. They say, recognizing that emotions are often what leads people to act, it is possible that feelings of ecological anxiety and grief, although uncomfortable, are in fact the crucible through which humanity must pass to harness the energy and conviction that are needed for the life-saving changes now required. And if you'd like to keep in touch, that's the link by which to find my newsletter. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that beautiful talk. Really appreciated it, really learned a lot. I'd like to ask Dr. Shear for her response.
Sure, this is a hard talk to respond to, I have to say. And Britt, it's magnificent, really. What you've been doing and how you presented it is really, really impressive. And there's so much, as you know, to talk about in this. But I think what I'll do is just try to take a couple of minutes and maybe we can have some dialogue. And what I want to tell you about is my journey in learning about grief, because I was trained as a psychiatrist a while back. And even today, no one in the mental health profession pays much attention to grief. I don't know if you know that, but it's not a topic that is covered, in particular, exactly understanding what it is. And my work has centered on loss of someone close. And so it's the death, loss by death specifically. And we grieve for a lot more than that. But I want to tell you about that because, and tell everyone about that, because in a way, I think it may be a kind of a prototype, so to speak, for loss of Mother Earth, so to speak, that is really what you're working so hard and talking about and presenting so beautifully about. And so what I've learned is that grief is actually, it's one of the, it's a sort of the mantra of our center, is that grief is a form of love. It really is literally a form of love. It's literally the form our love takes when someone we love dies. And, then we get into the sort of anticipatory grief that we're talking about here, but we are sort of talking about actual grief. But when we lose someone close, the way that our minds connect with other people that we're close to actually includes a response to being permanently separated from them, which includes a kind of proximity seeking. We immediately start proximity seeking. We immediately feel anxiety, and we immediately feel, often we feel guilt, and we kind of shut down our interest in everything else. So we call that acute grief. We've come to call that acute grief. And it's the natural reaction to losing someone close. We all experience it to a greater level or lesser extent. We're going to all experience acute grief when we lose, say, the person that we're closest to in the world. And so in a sense, we have to ask why, if that person's gone, why do we ever, why don't we just, anyone who's lost someone close, why don't they just like give up and that's it? And so the answer, I think, is that we have a natural sort of, there is evidence for this, but that we have a natural sort of instinct, so to speak, to adapt to a loss, to adapt to all the changes. So losing that person means losing a huge amount. And it also means changes in the world because other people have lost this person. Also, our social role changes, our social identity changes, so much changes. And we have to somehow make some kind of peace with that. So we have to adapt to a world that's totally changed. And how we do that is we need to, first of all, we have to do sort of two things more or less at once in order to get to where we want to go. And one of them is to accept the reality that we're in, which is basically the finality of the loss, but in this case, maybe not, hopefully not totally final, but we have to accept the reality, whatever is that reality is. And we have to restore our capacity for well-being in a new world, in a new place. And we do that, I think, by getting in touch with the things that we really care about. We call that, there's a theory in psychology called self-determination theory, which posits, and with a lot of empirical evidence, that all of us need to have a sense of autonomy, competence, and relatedness in order to thrive in life. And by autonomy is not, operating alone. It's really connecting with our own intrinsic interests and values. So we need to do that. We need to connect with what we really care about, what we really value, what brings us joy and satisfaction, and find something that we can think of to do that connects with that, really. So that's part of what we need. We need to feel some kind of sense of competence, and we need to have a sense of belonging and mattering. So I think these are all things that you talked about in a certain way, but it's a slightly different angle on that. And as we do that, the grief that we experience kind of evolves and changes naturally, because the experience of the loss changes as we essentially adapt to it, as we change ourselves. And we do that very naturally if we don't get in our own way. So that's the last piece that I want to mention, is because what happens right after someone dies is that we are so overwhelmed with emotion that we really can't basically do much of anything. So we have what you referred to the psychological defenses, I forget what exactly you called them, but John Bowlby, who is kind of the father of attachment theory and wrote about a lot of what I'm talking about, called this defensive exclusion. They're the defensive coping mechanisms that we automatically put in place. We all do this. And they are perfectly natural unless they get a foothold. And so what these what these are is the first thing we do is we sort of have a sense of disbelief. We can't really wrap our mind around what's happened until we can live it. And so there's a sense of disbelief. There's a sense of protest. We sort of say, no, this isn't what I want. This isn't what I need. This isn't what anyone needs. It shouldn't have happened, etc. And then we also have a tendency to take responsibility. We are caregivers naturally, so we take responsibility even when rationally we know it's not our responsibility. So there's that kind of self-blame, and sometimes that turns into anger because in various ways, and so that's another piece of it. And then a big piece is another thing that's been pretty well studied is something called counterfactual thinking. So we start to imagine alternative scenarios, and again, we all do that. And you can do that. You can do upward and downward counterfactual thinking. So upward counterfactual thinking is imagining a way that this could have been prevented, that it could have, something better could have happened. Downward counterfactual thinking is imagining that it could have been worse, and that tends to be a little bit comforting. The positive or upward counterfactual thinking tends to make us feel a little worse, but we like it because it makes us think that things really aren't as bad as they are. So people who get in trouble, who kind of get stuck in this grieving process, tend to do the upward counterfactual thinking a lot. And then the other thing is avoidance that you talked about. And avoidance is both behavioral avoidance. So we actually avoid things that remind us, that bring the grief to, remind us of the loss in this case, so we try to avoid confronting that, but we also try to avoid maybe it's part and parcel of the same thing, but we have an internal process called experiential avoidance, by which our minds also sort of deflect extremely painful emotions. So we try, we just gets us to think in another way. And again, these are all very, very natural ways to be, and maybe there are a few other of them, but basically the idea is that none of these can get a foothold. They are actually helpful in the beginning because we can't really wrap our minds around something that's so huge as losing someone close, or so huge as the world coming to an end, even huger. But we have to come to terms with it, like by dosing ourselves. So the defensive exclusion does allow us to dose ourselves, as long as we don't just hold on to it. And that's where courage comes into play to a certain extent, because it's scary even to let go of it in part, but that's really what we have to do. And we do it in conjunction with the, bringing the restoration of our capacity to thrive through autonomy, competence, and relatedness. So we kind of oscillate between thinking about what can be, what's something that we really want, that we really care about, that we really value, has to be in our lives, and at least possibly in the future in our lives, even if we can't do it now. Again, I think very consistent with what you talked about. So I do think there are maybe some interesting things that can be brought to bear on what you're talking about. And I really, really, again, so value what you're doing. And I spend a lot of time in California, so maybe we'll be able to, maybe I'll come to one of your meetings at Stanford.
Well, I would love that. Thank you so much. What a rich set of insights you've just shared. I would love to read any books or related materials that go with what you've just shared, because that provides a different scaffolding that helps clarify a lot of what I'm talking about, or just add new dimensions and weight to it. So thank you very much for that.
You're very welcome.
I just want to remind everyone, if you have any questions for our speakers, please drop them in the Q&A box. And I will kick it off by using my prerogative and asking questions. So, you mentioned the effect this has on climate scientists and other climate professionals. And I certainly feel the imperative to talk about emotions like fear and grief and anger. And I tend to get a lot of engagement when I talk about those things, and I think there's a reason for that. But my question for you is, how do we talk about joy? How do climate professionals acknowledge that we do also feel happiness in our lives? We do also experience good things. How ought we to talk about those?
I think it's such an important question, and you as a climate scientist ought to talk about that all that your heart desires. It's so important to demonstrate that this is a full human experience that we're talking about for all of us. This is not all doom and gloom, and that the other positive aspects of being alive are available to us still. And of course, what we're fighting for, right? This is about what we're protecting, our ability to tap into. Highlighting that is certainly, I think, should be as important as all the other emotions. It should never be shied away from just because many people are struggling with a new set of emotions around the climate crisis. At the end, I put up those guiding questions, but didn't go into them much around, what do you love most about being alive? I mean, it's a serious question to contemplate. Allow yourself to sit there and think through all the things that you're grateful for, which aside from having positive effects on how you feel, really help identify what we're orienting towards in this climate crisis and how we want to be. Yes, what it means to be human has already changed because we're in this changing planetary system, but we're going to burn out and we're going to tap out, and we're not going to enjoy ourselves along the way if we just focus on the rightful anger and the grief and the anxiety. So please, I hope that you are bringing that up as much as possible, especially with students, to model what is possible. And again, it gets into that importance of flexible thinking, which I personally had to work on. That was what was not available at first. That's when I was trapped in the narrative foreclosure around the future, and just reading about inevitable near-term societal collapse and so on and so forth. I mean, it really is hard to feel joyful when you're in that place, and that's the shackle that we need to help people break out of, because it really is inaccurate in terms of what we're dealing with.
Can I just make two comments about this? One is, I think we do need to do all of those things. We also need to live our joy. We not only need to talk about it, we need to live it. So, and that means, sometimes we call it self-care. One of the things we do in our intervention is we ask people to take 5 minutes a day and to do some simple rewarding activity, something that just take that time and do it. And we also have a sort of component where we ask people to think of aspirational goals, but I think however you do it, I think your thought about what makes you happy, that's great, but live it. And the other thing I want to say is that there may be a role here for survivor guilt, because maybe there are people who are hesitant to talk about or live the positives because of that. So that's just another piece, maybe.
So in the final 5 minutes, question came through. So question says, it seems that the destructive impacts of climate disasters will be felt more acutely by some communities than others. How do we ensure that people grieve not only their own losses, but others' losses, the deaths possibly experienced far away from us by strangers in remote places?
Yeah, thank you. It's very true, and it's so important as to why this conversation needs to focus on climate justice all the way through, in terms of also understanding the emotional distress that comes with the heap of effects of climate colonialism that we're now dealing with, in terms of why this is so much more damaging to many poor communities and communities of color around the world, and those who had the least to do with emitting heat trapping gases in the first place. But we we can't just do that by naming it, right? I mean, it's important to consistently name this and talk about climate justice, but I think it's also important to get proximate, like do work with communities who are on the front lines as much as possible when doing climate work, co-create the responses to, how we help create resilient communities and activate different forms of mitigation and adaptation along the way. I think that it's just an important stake in the ground to constantly be in our forefront and call out, because that whole slide about this being an unbearably white phenomenon, the critique there is that climate anxiety can serve to foment white fragility, where fragile, privileged people kind of turn inwards and navel gaze about how this is so hard for them, rather than really looking outwards and understanding those who are experiencing the most psychological distress and trauma and pragmatic crisis to their ability to live. So instead of turning inwards, it's an action of turning outwards and understanding this fact that we're all on the field, but it's a really uneven playing field. I wish I had a better answer, more succinct, of how to make sure that we can all do this all the time, but I think it just means that we're constantly wrestling with it and staying with the trouble of that and naming it, and then getting proximate when we can.
All right, we are almost out of time, but the last question that's just come through is, how do you go from functioning with one eye open and one eye shut to aligning your values to your actions day in and day out? So for example, you mentioned closing one eye and getting on the next flight. How do we move away from that when aligning to one's values can feel quite isolating, or we are made to feel weird for caring so much?
Yeah, I know that feeling. Firstly, it's the time of climate hypocrisy too, right? Like, we're all climate hypocrites. We're living in a carbon intensive system, and being able to own that none of this is perfect, and that we are going to be part of taking actions that transgress our sense of what's right. And that's what it means because we're in this society running off of fossil fuels in the ways that it does. And so I think that ambivalence and getting uncomfortable with that is an aspect of what it means to live well. But for me, and what I notice in others, is that the psychoeducation is really important. Understanding the ways that our unconscious can trip us up, being able to name it, being able to see these defenses that we sometimes flirt with in order to protect ourselves from anxiety and pain, or just to get by when reality is tough to bear. All of that can then create a bit of the empowerment around, okay, now I can name it. Now maybe I can tame it, in terms of that being the sane in society, in psychology. But it really is important to recognize, to then be able to crawl out of the grips of some of these things that otherwise hold us, and we're not conscious of it. But it's then helpful to go to something like the Venn diagram I mentioned, in terms of identifying how to align our values with our actions. Lean into the joy. Identify that this is a Venn diagram that comes from my Aunt Elizabeth Johnson, and it really just shows you the importance of going for what brings you satisfaction, happiness, love, and joy, because the things that you need to fill you up with those feelings in order for them to stick. Simultaneously identifying what you're good at. If you're a comedian, that's something to be able to rely on. If you're good with Excel sheets, that's something else. If you're good with kids, if you're an amazing educator, if you're great with climate modeling, I mean, there's lots of different ways to attach your skills. And then lastly, looking at the work that needs doing, which is of course enormous, and many details can be found at places like Drawdown, let's say, for ways in to then reveal a sweet spot of agency where those three Venn diagram circles overlap, about how you can start to align more deeply your actions with your abilities and the aspirational ways that you want to see the world move.
All right, well, I think that is a wonderful place to leave it. I could honestly carry on this conversation all night. It's so fascinating and it's so nourishing. So thank you so much for your talk. Thank you so much for your time. I want to remind all the attendees that there is a link to purchase the book, which I highly, highly, highly suggest you do, in the chat. And thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Ray and Dr. Shear.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me, and thanks for coming, everyone.